Hello everyone and welcome back to Complete and Total Random. Today I'm going to be going over the different shell types in War Thunder and how to use them. I'll also be going through individual vehicles to just kind of show just demonstrations of the ammunition types at play and how they kind of work. But let's get started. First I'm going to bring out the Achilles to get on with the basics. So we'll start with full caliber munitions, then we'll go to sub-caliber, and then to chemical munitions. So, to start with, all of these, this is the 17 pounder on the Achilles. These three shells, ignoring the smoke shell, all of these are purely kinetic shells. They have no explosive filler, and they're purely designed to use the kinetic energy from the round to penetrate a target. At lower BRs, these are your general purpose shells, usually having pretty good pen for their BR, but not as much post pen as an HE filled round. Now, to start with, there is four-ish types of pure armor piercing round, and then these types also apply to HE shells as well. Starting with your standard armor piercing shell, this is just essentially just a bullet. It acts just like a bullet, and it'll just punch through armor up to a certain thickness. Next, we have caps. How these work, just pure caps. So APC, that means cap. There's two different types of caps, ballistic capped, which we'll get to, and capped. All the standard cap does is increase the angled performance of the shell, basically by having a soft cap on the front of the nose of the shell. This allows the round, when it hits angled armor, to essentially pivot itself and come on at a more of a 90 degree, closer to a 90 degree angle, allowing for better penetration. And then after that, we have ballistic cap. Now this is not a purely ballistic cap shell, this is a capped ballistic cap shell, meaning it has a ballistic cap on top of its normal cap. This cap is basically just there to act on the shell to increase its aerodynamics. This allows it to have a higher velocity out of the barrel and maintain a higher velocity as it flies through the air. All of these types of shells can be found with AP filler in them. So AP CBC is usually your best round in general for general purpose. And then as you can see, when I'm shooting a target, usually, especially lighter targets, these shells have a tendency to just pass straight through, not exploding, doing very little damage to anything except for the direct point I hit. But due to their high velocity and ability to punch straight through armor, you can usually just point them at whatever you need dead in a tank and punch straight through it. Even at ranges, these shells can do quite a large amount of damage to enemy tanks, being able to penetrate armor from quite long distances with the ballistic caps. Your penetration fall off is much faster without the ballistic cap, and your angle pen is a lot worse without the normal standard cap. There's also a couple different machine gun rounds, and we'll go over those. They all act similarly to the normal shells. The only difference is they're fired out of machine gun, and there's one additional type. There's two additional types, incendiary and tracer. These can be combined with all the different types. Incendiary basically meaning that the shell has an incendiary filler in the nose, typically. When this is crushed, it has a slight explosive effect that can also light things on fire. And then tracer rounds are essentially, you see the red rounds coming out of my machine gun. Those are used just to help you distance your machine gun. A lot of them just have phosphorus in the rear of the round or other chemicals that make them glow so that they're a lot more visible and it's easier to see where your machine gun is firing at, especially at longer ranges where you can't use traditional iron sights to get the same effect. And it allows you to get your machine gun on target faster. which is what they're used for. I also have a chemical shell on me, and we'll just go over this one real quick. All this is a smoke grenade shell. These can technically damage crew members if hit with them. So if you have one loaded and something with exposed crew members comes out, you can technically damage the crew members by hitting them if I was to hit them and not miss. But it has no penetrative capabilities and is essentially completely useless against any sort of armor whatsoever. The main purpose of this round is for concealment. You can use it either to conceal yourself by shooting in front of yourself, or you can shoot at a target that's off in the distance and can blind them, allowing you to cross open areas. Now that we're done with the more standard basic shells, let's move on to some of the more interesting shells. Now, I'll just give a quick demonstration here of the APHE shells, kind of how they work. They have a slightly higher damaging effect, meaning they'll do more damage, they'll spread more shrapnel. But, especially on more cramped vehicles, solid shot usually works fine. But against things with more room inside of them, the APHE does a lot better, because as you can see, it'll burst when inside of the target. If I can get the round to ignite. Now, as you can see, my previous shot actually went through the back of that Panzer, completely overpenning it and not exploding. This is because these shells, if they don't hit hard enough material, can just pass through without their fuse on their nose being ignited. So, for instance, if I just shoot this guy, you'll see in the kill cam that the round itself didn't explode. This is because it over-penetrated. And in that instance, that's when you want to bring out things like HE to fire at open-top vehicles, or even splash around them. This is a basic HE shell. I'll go over it more when we go into semi-armor piercing and all of that. But for now, let's head back out. Let's head back out and we will go over some more ammunition types. So, HE, especially on smaller caliber guns like the Matildas, is quite useless due to its very low damaging effect and very low ability to crack armor. But if you get guns that are big enough, such as the KV-2, you can essentially just crack open enemy tanks with its penetration. And if you penetrate armor with HE, it will kill a target. But we'll go over more of the explosive rounds and the chemical rounds in a second. Let's continue on with our APCR. Now, I just need to find which tank I had for a second here. Where did I put that tank? There's also many other different weapon types. Some vehicles it's better to bring just pure solid shot, and other vehicles it's better to bring APHE, such as the Matilda, since it has so little explosive filler in it. You're better off just bringing armor piercing rounds to just penetrate through that extra little bit of armor, because the HE variants of shells usually have less pen due to them having a difference in weight and density. But next, let's bring out our first sub-caliber round. Armor piercing composite rigid. So this is a sub-caliber round. It's in a similar vein to APDS and to It's in a similar vein to APDS and your APFSDS. The only difference with this shell, and I can even show it in the protection analysis, is it has a very soft outer core, meaning that all of the energy is focused through the hard inner core of the shell. This means that it actually has worse angled performance but a lot better flat-on performance, meaning these rounds are a lot more for very specific scenarios when you really need that extra penetration. They also, because they're not very big and they're not very fast, they typically don't do much post penetration damage. In fact, if I shoot this, you can see that it does very, very little to the crew inside. Yeah, I took him out because it's such a cramped tank, but you can see how it has so little spall. Whereas if I shoot something like an APHE shell at this T-34, you can see how much spall it has, especially with its explosive rounds, or its explosive filler. And now that we've moved on through let's return to the hangar real quick, and we'll go up to our next subcaliber round, APDS. Now, one of the main drawbacks of APCR is because it has that soft outer shell that's wide, it creates a lot of air resistance, which slows the shell down, makes it a lot less effective. So, to counter that, APDS was invented. And essentially what this does is the shell itself is still sitting in that same Sabo configuration, except this one discards itself. So essentially it's little leaflets on the outside of the shell, and the air resistance causes them to basically pedal off and fly off once it exits the barrel. This allows for the shell to maintain much greater muzzle velocity and have a much higher pen because it's not being drawn back by that soft shell that's slowing it down, as well as this dramatically increases its anti-armor performance. It's still not the greatest against angled armor, but it's much better than APCR, and because of its high muzzle velocity, it does a lot more damage when entering tanks. Not as much as the next shell we're going to go over, not as much as the one that I just showed, but still quite a lot, as you'll be able to see. It creates large amounts of spalling and is traveling at high speeds. This also means that the shells are very great at range because they have such a flat trajectory. But even flatter than that is our next and final kinetic energy shell. There is still one more kinetic energy munition, but I'm going to include that later on in the video, and you guys will understand why when I get to it. But the final one is armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding Sabo. These rounds are typically a lot longer than APDS. This increases their angle performance. They're also stabilized by fins, allowing for a lot more stable flight and a lot higher muzzle velocity. These shells also have a lot higher weight compared to their APDS counterparts, allowing them to impart more energy. And when they penetrate a tank, if I hit the tank itself, of course, they do quite a lot more damage. In fact, these shells will do the most damage, especially the higher velocity shells, some of which go up to 2,000 meters per second in game, allowing them to basically just shred their way through armor. Next off, we have our next off we have our chemical munitions. Now these ones are very hit or miss. At lower BRs, these are usually typically a lot better against armor, but I'll go into it as we get to individual rounds. but they can be stopped very easily by modern armor. So composite armor and explosive reactive armor both are very good at stopping chemical munitions due to air gaps in them and other factors, which we will talk about as we go. So our first chemical munition that we will go through is basic HE. Now, basic HE is quite simple. All it is just an explosive shell. They have a fuse in the tip, which means that on contact, they will immediately detonate. These shells usually have typically a large explosive mass, allowing them to be very devastating to lightly armored and unarmored targets. But they have the drawback of being very poor against conventional armor, unlike the rest of the HE, or the rest of the chemical shells that we will go over. Now, there is HE shells that are slightly better in general against lightly armored targets, not heavily armored targets, but lightly armored targets and moderately armored targets. These are semi-armor piercing rounds. So SAP, they can also be called SAP HE or SAP HEI, the I being incendiary, having a similar effect to the incendiary machine gun rounds, being designed to create fire upon impact and ignite things like fuel and other things. And the idea with these is they're made of soft metal, which means that they can penetrate a little bit of armor and then they explode. So they're kind of like a AP HE shell, except a lot more explosive mass and a lot less penetration. HEs or shells are very unique. When you fire them, you want to fire them against like turrets and flat spots, so the explosion will go down into the hull, the weak roof armor of the hull, as opposed to on the face of the turret. As opposed to AP shells, which are in general usually pretty good at killing armor, and you kind of just need to know your limits with them. AP and APHE are generally balanced against each other. Like sometimes you'll bring one, sometimes you'll bring the other. Some vehicles, most vehicles though, in most cases, you're either using HE or you're using armor piercing rounds. Yeah, one distinct advantage that AP has over HE is just its general performance at penetrating armor, whereas the HE is a lot better at destroying lightly armored and non-armored targets, such as like if a unarmored target is hiding behind a building, you can fire beside the building to essentially just splash damage them to death. Like if I fire at this Black Panzer over here, if I hit close enough to it, I don't actually have to hit it to destroy it. Meaning that in certain situations it can be a lot better, a lot more effective against lightly armored targets, especially things that have a tendency to get overpenned. And if you can't just machine gun them to death, which is usually my technique, as I prefer using that over HE because I find HE can be very inconsistent. HE also has more problems, such as it won't go through things like light buildings and stuff like armor piercing rounds will, where armor piercing rounds will just over penetrate things like buildings, fences, and sometimes trees and still hit the target, whereas HE can be blocked by those fences. Sometimes even small bushes will cause the HE shell to detonate, which means that you got to be very careful with your shots and where they hit. This same goes for all kinetic or all chemical energy rounds. You got to be very careful where you're shooting them so that they don't detonate against something you don't want them to. And just as a demonstration of what I was talking about, If I fire this HE shell here, you can see I completely missed, but the shrapnel from the explosion, since it's such a large explosion, especially on something like a KV-2, because it's almost 6 kilograms of explosive mass, it essentially just annihilates open top targets and you can overpressure them. Now, let's get on to our next chemical shell. One that most people will be quite familiar with, especially if they've played a bit of top tier. If not, that's understandable. I guess if you're watching this video, you might also not have much experience. If you guys have any questions, obviously, just ask it in the comments below. But next we'll be showing off heat. These rounds are really good against flat armor. And just like their HE brethren, they detonate on contact. Meaning that they're good at any range, as long as you can hit the target. These shells commonly have a lot lower muzzle velocity than their armor-piercing counterparts, as you can see. This one having almost half the muzzle velocity, meaning it's quite a lot slower. You can see once I shoot this round and switch over, you can see how much more arc it has, especially when we compare it to our APCR shell. These shells are actually not too bad because you can still overpressure things, just like an HE shell. They're not as effective at it, but especially the larger caliber heat shells can. They are quite good because at ranges, because as you can see, even though it has less penetration at close distances, that penetration stays. Now, certain guns, especially things like the high velocity 75 that from the Panzer IV, aren't going to be as effective with it. The heat shells like this also are weakened by the amount of rifling, like how much spin is imparted on them, negatively affects their ability to penetrate a target. This is because essentially a heat shell wants to land as squarely and as flat on as a target as possible, and then it tries to impart as small of a essentially jet, usually of copper, through the target using explosives, allowing it to pen. This is why they're a lot worse against angled armor, and they are completely redundant against things like spaced armor, composite armor, and explosive reactive armor. ERA, which all will stop these rounds basically completely in their tracks, with one major exception for chemical rounds, but when we get to that, I'll talk about it. These rounds, though, are actually some of the best, especially in mid-tiers, against conventional armor. So things like the MAWs and your IS-7s and those extremely heavy tanks are very weak against such things. Next up, for chemical munitions, we will be going to demonstrate another type of shell that's essentially just a high explosive shell, but with a slight twist. This is squash head. So essentially how it acts is it squashes against the target before detonating. It's usually made out of a plastic explosive, so it doesn't detonate through its compression. Because plastic explosives, even though they're a high explosive, aren't actually that easy to set off. Now these shells have an extremely large amount of explosive force. That's the first time I've ever seen one of them over pen. I'm just going to restart because this tank has a very long reload. These shells are quite interesting. They're actually almost the opposite of heat because they are better against angled armor, and they're better with rifling. And essentially the idea is it flattens out against the target, and it doesn't always actually penetrate, but it's designed so it blows out shrapnel from the inside of the armor. So the wider it spreads out, the better it works, but it is also, again, very weak to things like composite armor and explosive reactive armor, because any standoff distance, any of that, will make this completely useless. But they do more. They do more shrapneling against angled armor, making them extremely effective against angled armor on heavy tanks, as long as the shell is big enough to penetrate. These shells are very niche. There's a very small handful of vehicles that use them, like as anti-armor versus other rounds in game, just because other rounds end up being a lot more consistent at destroying tanks. But things like the FE 4005, as you can see, don't really care as much. Now, it does have one issue where these rounds do have a tendency to just not do as much damage as HE. They don't usually overpressure like HE because of how they work. So it's a lot easier to penetrate targets than HE, but a lot of the times you get a lot less shrapneling. Though sometimes targets will just be completely eviscerated and overpressured by the round itself. It's not quite as effective as just pure HE on a lot of super big cannons. Because a lot of pure HE cannons, you can just hit the turret and it'll blow out the roof of the hull. Now, we will continue. I'm going to finish. I think we'll finish the unguided. That is the wrong T-34. 1 second. I grabbed the wrong one. Just give me one moment here. So there's another kind of interesting type of chemical shell. This one's really interesting. So essentially the idea with shrapnel shells is they're filled with ball bearings, so that when the shell enters and explodes, it does a tremendous amount of shrapnel damage as opposed to HE. So the idea with this is that it can do a lot more penetrating, or a lot more effective damage against the target. But its main drawback is, of course, that it doesn't have a lot of pen due to its very weak shell casing. But when it does penetrate, it does quite a bit of damage. These shells are really inconsistent, and I believe they only appear on a small handful of vehicles. But when you do penetrate, usually they'll do quite a lot of damage inside. Now, there is one kind of more, well, maybe, it depends how you count it, but there's 2 more unguided munitions. There's also another one that I'll show at the end, which is technically just our chemical munition, like standard chemical munitions as far as the game is concerned. And these are the grenades. These are just normal grenades. Essentially, they're just mini HE shells, but they are considered a different type of shell in game. So I'm just gonna give them a quick mention, as well as there's one other separate type, well, 2 other separate types of munitions that I'll go over quickly. Just a quick rundown. There's also the AVRE petard, which has a spigot mortar, not a traditional cannon, but it essentially just launches what is essentially just an HE shell. there is the German Sturmtiger, which fires a rocket mortar. Not a rocket, but a rocket mortar. The difference being that it's propelled from a gun, and how it's prepared from a gun. The game just considers it a rocket. But from what I understand, it's considered a rocket mortar, which I guess is slightly different. And then another really interesting chemical weapon, unguided one, that's in game. It's only on 2 vehicles at the moment. I hope they add it to a couple more. Currently, it's only on this one's only on the Churchill, and the TO-55 is the flamethrower. These are only useful against open-top vehicles, but are extremely useful against open-top vehicles as they immediately ignite them and can essentially pretty close to instantly kill the crew. A lot of people won't mention them, but I think they're worth mentioning because they do act a bit differently. They are completely useless against any type of armor though, as they won't penetrate armor, and there's no way to damage any components on a tank using a flamethrower other than crew. So unless there's exposed crew, you can't really do anything to enemy tanks with it. That was just me shooting my cannon at it. And then next we can go on to rockets. Now, all rockets in game are HE. Essentially, they're just HE shells that are propelled by a rocket motor. And how these work is you just fire them, they're propelled by a rocket. When they hit a target, they explode. For it to be considered a rocket, it is unguided, whereas missiles are guided. So that's the difference when you're just reading through terminology. If you're wondering, a lot of them have different amounts of explosive mass and do varying amounts of damage based on their sides. They can all overpressure. There's a handful of tanks in the game that have them. I believe almost all of them are premiums, other than I think the Magach 6 is the only, or the Magach Hydra is the only tech tree rocket vehicle. Next up on the list, we have missiles. So I'll also go through all of the guidance types for missiles. There is also another type of kind of rocket called a heat grenade. These are on vehicles like the M50. Essentially, these are used out of things that can't fire traditional heat shells, like recoilless rifles. Now, for missiles, there's a couple different types. So yeah, here's a heat anti-tank grenade. They're designed to be fired out of things with weaker breaches and slower muzzle velocities, allowing weaker guns to kind of fire them. But of course, they're just a heat grenade with a lot of the main downsides. Now, how these missiles work, these are wire guided. So and how that works is it means that it is controlled. Let me try that again. Oops, I forgot. I believe I need to stay in the sight for this. Now, essentially how these work. Oh, this is a wire guided one. or laser guided. So there's also laser guided missiles, and how these work is they're guided by your mouse. These also struggle against things like heat, but as you can see, wherever I point my mouse, the missile will go. So I can use it to hit targets, especially targets on the move. Grab the wrong BMP. But now, I mean, we might as well carry on with the show and go back and show the older variant. So there's laser guided, and then the BMP-1. I thought we just brought this out. I thought this has... Am I going crazy here? 1 second. I could have sworn that was a wire-guided missile, but I guess not. Oh wait, what was I testing it? No, I was testing it in realistic. Let me just double check. Yeah, so these are laser guided. I think the game may have changed that then. Because before you used to have to use your arrow keys to aim those, so if it has changed, I guess I won't say anything else, but if it hasn't, then I'll just, yeah, and that is what it is. So yeah, there's wire guided missiles. I guess they changed it so those follow your mouse cursor now to an extent. There is also SACLOS, which is laser guided. These are also just heat shells. So they just act like typical heat. They're bad against composite armor, they're bad against explosive reactive armor, and they're bad against spaced armor. These ones are guided by lasers, which means they can also be disrupted by the active protection systems. So like there is some that have laser disruptors on them, such as the T90A, which I'll pull up right now, which can shoot them down. You can see these little boxes on the turret. Those are there to basically stop lasers. The X-ray doesn't seem to want to work, but yeah, so those are there to disrupt lasers and basically scramble them. And then of course, explosive reactive armor is pretty common. You can see it on things like the Moderna. They have different protection against chemical and kinetic, but usually they're a lot better against chemical munitions than kinetic munitions. And there's also vehicles with active protection systems which can shoot down missiles, such as the DRAWS system on the T-80 UM2. Basically, if you fire at the front of the turret of this, these will shoot out basically a charge that will fire out and explode in front of the tank, blowing up the missile before it hits the tank. Anything with a low enough muzzle velocity can be stopped with things like active protection systems. So that's something to be mindful of. And then our final missile, well, our final missile type, not our final missile guidance type. Oh no, I guess it's not our final missile type. Our final chemical missile type is going to be tandem warheads. These essentially work by having a heat shell with another heat shell behind it. So the first heat shell will hit things like explosive reactive armor and punch its way through. And then the second one, when it hits a target, will basically, so the first shell hits the explosive reactive armor, punches its way through it, and then the next charge hits the basic armor itself underneath and punches through that, making it much, much better against your typical explosive reactive armor, as you can even see there. That's exactly what it's designed for, making it quite good at that. Now we get on to what is honestly what I find to be the most interesting missile in the game, which we will go over, and then I'll show you the final munition guidance type for missiles, is the LOSAT, which just stands for line of sight anti-tank. This was an American test bed to essentially see if they could take a missile with essentially almost like a sabot round inside of it, propel it to supersonic speeds, and use it as a kinetic energy penetrator. So it's using the actual force of the rocket itself to push through the armor as opposed to using explosives. This means that it will instantly defeat things like ERA. And due to its extreme power, does a lot of damage upon penetration. You can see how it essentially just one-shots because the missile is so big and it's imparting so much energy. The tests of this video also just show it literally just detonating vehicles, like lighting them on fire just from the kinetic energy itself. And these missiles are kind of different from everything else, as they actually get more penetration as they accelerate through the air, allowing them to do more damage at their peak energy, and then they start losing it after that. Now, I don't know what their maximum their maximum penetration looks like it's 775 millimeters at a kilometer, and then after that it slowly starts to fall off. These missiles are unique in game, being the only of this type. They're also, as you can see, laser guided. And now let's get on to the final guidance type for missiles. So you've seen the wire guided and the laser guided. The final guidance method, I believe it's currently only on 2 vehicles, maybe 3. I know there's 2 vehicles in the German tree, the Vilkis and the Puma, that have this. These are the Spike LR2s. These are lock-on anti-tank missiles. So as you can see, I can just lock onto a target and fire. They also work at like surface-to-air missiles, except they require a direct hit to kill. But as you can see, they also work against vehicles. They lock onto targets, so you can just lock onto a target on the move and fire it, and it'll try and hit it as long as you're close enough. But you can see this, if I lock onto that and then fire, the missile will follow the target and hit it. Essentially, it just tracks the target and uses that to hit them. These missiles are also tandem. They're quite wonky in game. And yes, that is the final ordnance for attacking ground. Kind of. There is technically one more ordnance, but it is only useful against aircraft. So let me grab the Ocelot here real quick. Or I guess I'll grab the Strela, since I grabbed the wrong tree. And how this works is it fires a surface-to-air missile. These are either radar-guided or radar-guided. They track your target, you lock onto it, and then they're designed to explode when they get within a close enough range of the target. So if I just come on, and then I fire, you'll see the missile go out, it tracks the target, hits it. These can be defeated by things like flares and chaff, depending on the munition type, but this allows essentially for you to just lock onto air targets and fire and forget missiles. Usually these are a lot more effective than normal cannon fire at taking out aircraft, especially unsuspecting aircraft, or if they're flying close, because usually they won't have time to evade. But yeah, that is all of the mutation types for War Thunder. If you guys liked the video, let me know. If it was informative, just let me know. If you guys got any questions as well, just let me know in the comments below. Whatever you guys. And yeah, if you guys have any suggestions for like what you would like me to go over next about War Thunder, let me know. And I'd like to thank you all for watching. Peace.